Somebody very nicely gifted me a copy of the Shen Yun article about Shen Yun being a cult. It's in the New York Times, and we are going to read it for Devotions with Daniela. Today for Devotions with Daniela, we are going to read about the Shen Yun cult from the article in the New York Times that somebody very kindly gifted me. Behind the pageantry of Shen Yun, untreated injuries and emotional abuse. They began appearing about 2 decades ago, often around the holidays and often at high-end venues. Troops of Chinese dancers swirling gracefully in colorful costumes. First in New York City, then in Paris, Toronto, and Taipei, the dancers, mostly teenagers and young adults, flipped and vaulted on stage in soaring routines meant to awe and entertain, and also to spread the message of Falon Gong, the persecuted Chinese religious movements behind the performances. Since then, the dance group, Shen Yun Performing Arts, has grown into an economic engine for the movement and its leaders, with brisk ticket sales on 5 continents and holdings of more than 265 million, which is as much as just one dude that started Zappos had to start it with. That Zappos was also kind of a cult. But for the young people who powered the show, the success has come at a steep cost. In pursuit of ever larger audiences, Shen Yun has treated many of its performers as an expendable commodity, a New York Times investigation has found. It has routinely discouraged them from seeking medical care when their bodies have broken down and commanded their obedience to grueling rehearsal and tour schedules through relentless emotional abuse and manipulation. And cults hate medical care because I believe it's because it's an ultimately individual act. And the unspoken rule in a cult or really any kind of total institution is you are never more important than the group. So medical care, physical or mental, is the ultimate act of betrayal of the group. And the army demonizes medical care as well. In some interviews, former dancers recounted performing through dislocated kneecaps, sprained ankles, or other serious injuries, unwilling to seek medical treatment because the group's belief system regarded such care as a crutch of the unfaithful. Others were racked with emotion as they recalled being made to participate in regular weigh-ins by instructors who publicly berated them for being too fat. U.S. Army, looking at you. Most described feeling, and remember that cults always want you skinny. Most described feeling used by a religious movement that was focused on spreading its views, even if performers were harmed in the process, while raking in money from ticket sales. And cults often use performance arts as a way to both get money, because most people don't go to a performance and question if the dancers are being paid or well paid. I didn't. But also it's a way of teaching your people to be on all of the time and performing. Many of the dancers and musicians who spoke to the Times hesitated to share their stories publicly, fearing retaliation by Falun Gong and its spiritual leader. That leader, Li Hongzhi, introduced the movement in China in 1992, at a time when ancient energy-based exercises were surging in popularity. It was also a time when cults were surging through Asia, because that is what happens in times of social turmoil. He has led it in exile while presiding over the guarded 400-acre compound in upstate New York, where many of Shen Yun's performers live and train. Now, when cult leaders say they're exiled, I always want to take that with a grain of salt. But also, let's introduce the concept here of geographic abuse. This is Jim Jones taking his people to Jonestown. This is the children of God taking us all over the world and living in American communes where we mostly didn't speak the language of the people outside. And I remember as a 10-year-old teaching myself Portuguese and understanding that I was going to be more connected to the outside world and that was going to make me safer. But most of these people, even if they could get away, they're in New Jersey, probably without many marketable skills outside of performance. In a statement, representatives of Shen Yun and Falun Gong said the performers who spoke to the Times were presenting a picture of the dance group and religious movement that distorted reality in bizarre and dramatic ways, the way that the cults always do. They said that the Times was playing into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, which has sought to stamp out the movement by committing a bigoted attack on a faith that promotes good health, moral living, and strong families and communities. But why is it that these groups that promote good health, strong families, and communities always hurt the individuals and have so many secrets? I wonder. Also, using the Communist Party is genius. And it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that Americans are so biased against the words Chinese and communism that it's going to work out for them. And by the way, two things can be true. A bad government can reject a cult while the cult is still a cult. And if you need a concrete example, the Children of God tried to move to Israel first. Oh, and the Children of God is what I wrote my book about, and it is the PEDO cult. Yeah, really bad guys. And still, Israel maybe not the good guys on the world scale. Based in part on elements of Buddhism, Falun Gong holds that people who practice its poses and meditation regimen can attain enlightenment. And anyone that tells you that their process will work for you is trying to con you or cult you. And also, this is an example of cults always offering space travel, right? In another realm, you are going to achieve enlightenment, in another state, in another body, after you give us all your money. But in speeches and writings, its founder, Mr. Lee, has also incorporated less conventional ideas, implying that he is the creator of the universe, saying that faithful adherents can purge the body of illnesses, and suggesting that followers can develop supernatural powers, space and sci-fi stuff, such as the ability to levitate. And this is how it works. Cult leaders go about and they create their worldview, often based on something that already exists, like Buddhism. But then they just tweak it and they tell you that they are more right. And this is the reason that they are more special. The cult leader always has to make himself one of a kind. This is what I call the road to deification, to getting people to treat you as God or as godlike. And for the past 2 decades, Mr. Lee has positioned his group in direct opposition to the ruling Chinese Communist Party, which has imprisoned Falun Gong followers and demonized them in state propaganda. Against that backdrop, Mr. Lee's movement has put Shen Yun forward as a propaganda tool of its own, amplifying the show's anti-communist messages through a network of companies founded by Falun Gong practitioners, including a widely read newspaper, the Epoch Times. Inside Shen Yun, the group's leaders told their young performers that each show was an urgent spiritual mission. And they led them to believe that anyone who spoke out against the movement would face dire consequences. Even so, 25 former dancers, musicians, and instructors spoke openly to the Times about their experiences in Shen Yun, including a handful who had left the group within the past 18 months. They described a pattern of abusive behavior by Shen Yun's leaders that spanned nearly 2 decades and occurred as hundreds of performers cycled in and out of the dance company. Their accounts, along with hundreds of pages of public records and dozens of photos and recordings smuggled out of the group's headquarters, offer an unusually candid look at life inside the productions, which Shen Yun's ubiquitous advertising has billed as entertainment of the highest order. And the fact that documents have to be snuck out, not a good thing, methinks. Nothing in the advertisement signals that the show is aimed at promoting a religious movement. And audience members, who may pay $309 a ticket, have little indication that the performers are laboring for that movement. They see smiling dancers who leap on stage and spend the next 2 hours performing synchronized spins and flying splits. Some scenes portray Falun Gong followers being beaten by Chinese state police. But many of the former dancers and musicians said they pushed themselves to their physical and mental limits because they were taught that performing a flawless Shen Yun show would save their audiences from an approaching apocalypse. You got to have that fear. It was a message that was constantly reinforced in lessons that instilled a fierce sense of obligation, as well as mistrust of the outside world, they said. Often they worked 15-hour days because cults are always about labor. rehearsing, performing, even setting up and breaking down heavy orchestra equipment for low or no pay, toiling under the impression that they were indebted for the cost of schooling, food, and lodging that the movement provided them. And if you're not clear, this is labor trafficking. Even just happening inside of a cult, still labor trafficking. When we talk about labor trafficking, survivors of children of God like to be like, it wasn't labor trafficking, we chose it, or our parents signed papers. Like, no, you don't have the option to just sign away your rights or your children's rights. Labor trafficking is still labor trafficking, even if you have agreed to it. Nearly all performers were sent to Shen Yun by family members who were ardent Falun Gong practitioners. Some had arrived at the movement's New York State headquarters, known as Dragon Springs, having not yet turned 12, because of course we're going to get the children. They were unable to leave the compound without special permission and were typically limited in how often they could see their families. Many had traveled to New York from across the United States and other countries and remained in the complex well into their 20s. And this is the kind of scholar I am, where I don't know if they're going to get to cult and like really bad accusations in this yet, but you could put me in that compound and I could lead you to the sexual abuse and the financial abuse. I promise you. Shang Qingling, who grew up practicing Falun Gong with her mother in New Zealand, arrived at Dragon Springs at age 13. Miss Shang, a former dancer, now 27, said she rationalized her bad experiences there. The untreated injuries that made her left arm go numb, the constant yelling by instructors, the shaming of her classmates for breaking minor rules by giving them a higher meaning. They're just testing our devotion, Miss Shang said she told herself. But then I thought, if I use normal human values and judge this is wrong. Some performers who wanted to quit before the group was ready to let them go faced threats and intimidation. Their managers told them they would go to hell or face danger if they left, because they would lose Mr. Lee's protection. 7 former performers said they were also told they would have to repay the cost of tuition if they quit Shen Yun. Yeah, you're free to leave anytime. You're free to leave anytime. The representatives of Shen Yun and Falun Gong declined to make Mr. Lee and other Shen Yun leaders available for interviews. In their statement, the representatives, Ying Chen and Levi Brode, called the performers who spoke to the Times a relatively disgruntled tiny group who shared fantastical stories. And I repeat, and I repeat, and I repeat, there is no valid reason for an organization ever to tell you not to speak to former employees. If it is true that it's only a small disgruntled group, a rational person will see that. But also lies the question, why are they disgruntled? Why? They denied that performers who got hurt routinely went without medical care, and they said any suggestion of a toxic environment at Dragon Springs was highly subjective and smacks of cultural bigotry. The community at Dragon Springs is a close-knit, predominantly Asian community that values disciplined study and training and is characterized by open, honest, and direct interactions. They said, "We are essentially, ding, 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 a big family with a shared faith, and anything that calls itself your family wants to overwork you, underpay you, and expect you to put up with more bullshit than you would otherwise." And I just want to keep bringing this back to geographic abuse because there is a reason they have headquartered in America. And it's because they know they can be like, this is bigotry, this is racism, this is attacking a minority group. The Times reporting on Shen Yun, they added, was likely to become the crown jewel in the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to discredit Falun Gong. The Chinese government banned Falun Gong after more than 10,000 practitioners staged the silent protest outside the Communist Party's headquarters in Beijing in 1999. Since then, many practitioners have been detained and died in police custody. Chinese officials have continued to target them. And I'm just going to say, not that I'm saying they're wrong to fight the Chinese Communist Party, but cults are always out for political power, and cult leaders are often staging political things because it gets them attention and it helps them find followers. Still, the movement has flourished, amassing a global following whose members can be seen practicing gentle movement exercises in parks worldwide. As Falun Gong spread, Mr. Li gained influence as well. He helped create the Shen Yun performance group in 2006. Now with his wife, Li Rui, he presides over Dragon Springs, the upstate compound that is fitted with a towering pagoda and a giant golden statue of Buddha, with a face that bears a striking resemblance to his own. A little more deification for you. Students living on the mountain, as the compound is also known, we called our compounds things like the park and the oasis, are taught to greet Mr. Li as Shifu, the Chinese word for master, while clasping their hands and bowing. They quickly learned that Miss Li is a primary enforcer of the rules. Meet the Chinese cult version of the skinny white woman. Many of the former performers reached by the Times said that Shen Yun gave them the opportunity to travel and improve their Chinese language skills, and they appreciated the work ethic it instilled. This is the same thing we said about growing up in the pedo cult, the Children of God. I speak 3 languages. I mean, it's worked out great for me throughout my life. Doesn't that mean it was all good? Personally, I cherished the time I spent at Shen Yun. I learned and matured a great deal, said Susan Zhao, a former dancer with the company, in an email to the Times. I think it's a wonderful institution that creates an inspiring show for people all around the world. And just so we know, of course we should listen to ex-members, bad and good. But there's always a broad base of people who experience the cult, who only experience the good stuff. And those people will go down with the ship. Usually. But the vast majority said it also exposed them to unyielding indoctrination. During a lecture last year, Mr. Li, who's in his early 70s, told students in Chinese that he created the earth and established the music of mankind, according to a recording of his remarks provided to the Times by an audience member. Having all of your words recorded, too, is another cult leader thing. Questioning such rhetoric was seen as a grave offense. What I experienced there is tremendous psychological pressure to conform, said David Fiedler, 66, who taught violin at Dragon Springs from 2013 to 2016. You have to either leave or you have to be willing to abandon your reason because you can't hold on to both. And this is what it really means when people are like, you're free to leave anytime. It is reinforcing that the dynamic is their way, exactly what the leader says, or you're gone and you lose all of this in one fell swoop. It is actually invoking the exit cost for you every time they say that. At age 11, Kate Wang dropped out of her school in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, and traveled some 8,000 miles with her mother to rural Cuddebackville in Orange County, New York, the home of Falun Gong's headquarters. There she enrolled in Fei Tian Academy of the Arts, the boarding school where Shen Yun performers are trained. Miss Wang had no dance experience, but she grew up around Falun Gong followers who had told her to seize the chance to be closer to Mr. Li. Her grandmother had practiced the exercises every morning at 4 a.m. Her mother had sold tickets to Shen Yun shows. Everyone said it was the place you should be because it's the best place to be on the earth, said Miss Wang, now 26, who asked to be identified by her English first name. Soon afterwards, she was in a dance class, lying on her back for a flexibility exercise. Hovering over her, a teacher gripped her ankle and began pushing it toward her head, moving it farther and farther until Miss Wang heard a snap from her thigh that seemed to echo across the classroom, she said. Her teacher notified Mr. Li and the school principal, who touched her leg as if to see if anything was broken. She limped for weeks, she said. A few years later, before a performance in Seattle, Miss Wang was landing a front flip when she felt a searing pain in her right leg. She had dislocated her kneecap, she said. A classmate popped it back into place. One of her managers gave her a bag of ice and asked if she could still perform, Miss Wang said. She danced in excruciating pain for the next 2 hours. She said that she was not offered treatment for either injury, nor did she seek it, because Mr. Lee says that true healing occurs only by following his teachings. If I ask for the hospital, I will be labeled as not a fervent believer, said Miss Wang, who added that her knee has never felt the same. I didn't want to stick out or become a target of everyone. Miss Wang was one of 14 former Shen Yun performers, who told the Times that they suffered untreated injuries or ailments, or saw others get hurt without receiving care. Performing in any competitive dance company carries a risk of injury, sports medicine experts said, but unlike many other companies, Shen Yun does not provide routine access to physical therapists or doctors, the Times found. And the group's reliance on teenage dancers whose bones and muscles are still developing has meant they were more prone to getting hurt, the experts said. The risk was especially acute given Shen Yun's demanding choreography, which calls for backbending moves that incorporates elements of ballet and gymnastics. It was increased further by the group's punishing schedule, which sent the student performers on tour for months out of the year, with bus rides between venues that could drag on for 16 hours at a time. Often they put on 2 shows a day. On its most recent tour, Shen Yun's 8 troupes were scheduled to perform more than 800 shows in 5 months. One played 14 shows in 12 days at the New York's David Koch Theater at Lincoln Center. Encouraging people to dance in pain or discouraging them from treatment is pretty barbaric and old school, to say the least, particularly with minors, said Dr. Daniel Rose, an orthopedic surgeon and founding director of the Harkness Center for Dance Injuries at NYU Langone Health. Especially in that age group that doesn't have the ability to advocate for themselves, permanent damage can definitely be done. Some Shen Yun performers who suffered severe injuries did receive treatment. When Sam Pu, one of the group's highest profile dancers, ruptured his Achilles tendon, he underwent surgery to repair it, he said in a video posted online last year. In their statement, the representatives of Shen Yun and Falon Gong denied discouraging medical treatment, because of course they did. Shen Yun performers are offered and receive medical treatment whenever it is needed, and we have the medical records to prove it, they said. However, any other dance company at this level would have medical professionals on staff. But former performers and instructors told the Times that such interventions were rare. Daisy Wang, who started touring with Shen Yun when she was 13, said she sprained her ankle 5 times in 8 years, but never asked for a doctor. Doing so, Miss Wang and others were told, would mean that something was wrong with their spiritual state. It's supposed to self-heal if you just send forth righteous thoughts, said Miss Wang, now 28, referring to the meditation technique Mr. Lee prescribes to purge the bad karma he says causes illness. Dancers were not the only members of Shen Yun who performed through the pain of injury. A former musician who asked to be identified only by his last name, Anne, said he frequently sliced his hands on metal instrument cases when packing the dance group's cargo truck after performances. One cut was so severe that he had to stitch himself up with a hotel sewing kit, he said. After playing in Shen Yun's orchestra for about 4 years, another musician, a violinist named Joshua Lin, began to feel sharp pains near his right shoulder. He was brought to see Mr. Lee, who touched his head and shoulder and told him he was healed. The pain persisted for years, a sign, his classmates told him, of his weak faith. I just kept playing through the pain, Mr. Lin said. In the Children of God, they actually developed a whole concept for forced exercise every day, and it was called Get Out. And it was from our leader getting so mad at my stepfather for having asthma and not having the faith to conquer it that he blamed it on not being outside enough every day. He did not see a doctor until he left Shen Yun. Only then did he learn the likely cause of the pain, a bulging disc in his spine. Next part is called keeping up appearances. I bet you also, even if it doesn't show up here, there's some significant bathroom control of the performers, because we almost always see this in cults. And I just want to point out that there's not a single thing here that sounds so horrifying that the U.S. Army doesn't do to its soldiers. As some vet bro tried to dude-splain me yesterday, I don't think the Army's at the same level of cult as like the Children of God or Shen Yun. But they can never give details when you ask, oh, really? Please point out the differences, because I have not, again, heard one thing here that I can't give you a direct parallel for from the Army. Former students also said they suffered emotional abuse and manipulation. 5 former dancers said they were humiliated by instructors in front of classmates when they failed to lose weight. One of the dancers, Chang Chun Ko, said that when she was 13, stood 5'5" and weighed about 110 pounds, her dance teacher singled her out for being heavier than others in her troupe. The teacher told her classmates to report Miss Chang if she bought snacks, in line with Shen Yun's broader culture of encouraging students to inform on one another, which is textbook cult. She and others said, more than once, classmates physically blocked her from entering a market on campus, she recalled. On another occasion, the teacher called her shameless for buying 3 cans of Pringles on her day off. When the teacher questioned whether Miss Chang wanted to stay in Shen Yun, Miss Chang began to cry. Still, she desperately wanted to fulfill what she considered to be her oath to Mr. Li. Master told us he had endless magical powers, said Miss Chang, now 28, in Chinese. We were little children, and we believed. By the time she was 20, she was usually eating just 1 meal a day. As she sipped rice porridge one day, a different teacher asked why she was eating at all. She ran to the bathroom and kicked the walls. Another former dancer recalled weekly weigh-ins that felt like walking to a guillotine. She put her body into starvation mode, she said, and would strip off clothing before stepping onto the scale. Her weight was recorded on a sheet posted in a classroom with the names of those deemed to be too fat to be scrawled in red. This is textbook U.S. military, where you have weigh-ins every 6 months, and this is exactly the kind of stuff that happens. A third recalled Ms. Li telling her to eat only cucumbers and tomatoes to lose weight. She said, at 16, she developed an eating disorder. Almost every soldier, male and female, leaves the military with disordered eating. Miss Wang, the former dancer from Taiwan who dislocated her kneecap, was repeatedly told by teachers that she was becoming too heavy. At 17, she was reassigned to a warehouse job on campus, designing patterns for Shen Yun's costumes on a computer. Near the end of high school, she was notified that she would not be accepted into the post-secondary school in Dragon Springs, Feitian College, and would have to leave the compound. The culture of body shaming reflected a fixation on the part of Shen Yun's leaders on outward appearances, former students said. During a 2016 Falon Gong conference, Miss Li said Shen Yun was crafting its aesthetic to appeal to those in the middle class and above, including people who are well-educated, civilized, and high caliber, according to a translation of his remarks. The focus on image was reinforced by Miss Li, who often wore designer clothes and took dancers shopping on their days off. Some former students said they were confused to see her dressed so fashionably, given that her husband's teachings were critical of material attachments. One former dancer said Miss Li once gave her a Chanel wallet. It's important to understand that like cults use these black and white purity requirements, like you shouldn't have fancy things, but the cult leaders themselves are never bound by the black and white rules. Neither are the people who are their favorites at the time, very a la King Henry VIII. Ms. Li sought to manage not only the students' appearances, but also their dating lives. Dating required permission from Miss Li's office, and there you have it. And I always say, when organizations are telling consenting adults who they should and should not sleep with, it gets problematic. Another way in which Shen Yun's leaders exerted control over their performers, former students said. 11 of those students said that Ms. Li and her students tried to arrange relationships between foreign students and American citizens. which they believed were encouraged for visa purposes. Ron Luo, who played viola for Shen Yun until 2021, said he thought the matchmaking tactic was to tie young people more closely to the movement. Of course it is. The Children of God had this big movement to marry children as young as 12 years old to each other. The U.S. Army culture encourages getting married very, very young. And before the dude-splaining starts, I had someone be like, it's not true. I brief them all the time to not get married young. I'm like, yeah, but the Army pays them more money and lets them move out of the barracks if they're married. That's how your culture encourages it. It's like keeping your labor, he said. Getting a person that fits the mold of what they want is quite difficult. You need the religious background. You need to be subservient to unreasonable demands. Can't you endure hardship? Oh, I already know what this is going to be. In the Children of God, it was, don't you have the faith? From the moment Sun Zan enrolled at Dragon Springs at 15, he heard Mr. Lee preach about the holy mission Mr. Sun and other performers were undertaking to save non-believers by allowing them to watch a Shen Yun show. This is the transcendent mission, by the way. Compounding the pressure, Mr. Sun and 6 other former performers said Mr. Lee and his subordinates told them that any mistakes on stage might eventually doom their audiences to hell. It made them approach each show with unswerving seriousness. Mr. Sun, a former principal dancer, said he typically slept just 5 hours a night so he could rehearse routines to perfection. Cults want you tired and busy and hungry and skinny and breeding, or sometimes forcibly not breeding. And the one I can't remember. Hungry, tired, skinny, busy, pregnant, I think isolated. It's actually the mental trauma that still affects me today, Mr. Sun, who left in 2015, said. If you don't do it right, then it's on you. Then the universe is not saved because of you. Nathan G., a cello performer, once played a wrong note at a performance in Mexico City, and afterward, his orchestra manager grilled him for an hour. She accused him of focusing too little on Mr. Lee's teachings and reading other things too much, he said. She confiscated his Kindle. And the people controlling what you're allowed to read are never the good guys. Information is never bad. Such chidings were commonplace. In an audio recording from last year obtained by The Times, an orchestra manager can be heard chastising a group of performers for more than an hour, saying that they needed to work harder to reach Mr. Lee's standards. Didn't we all make a promise to master? She asked in Chinese. Can't you endure hardship? Mr. Lee and his wife encouraged students to further view him as a father figure, they said. Some recalled celebrating Mr. Lee on Father's Day and his birthday, and like Danielle, a scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership, always said, if you're celebrating your leader's birthday, it's a cult. United States of America looking at you. They said they wrote poems for him and gave him gifts like folded paper cranes. This is part of the deification, y'all. At the same time, some former students said they were instructed not to share aspects of their Shen Yun experience with their parents. Many students saw their families only once a year during a 2-week summer break. There's your isolation. Their supervisors at the mountain also exerted control over their access to outside information, discouraging dissent and critical thinking, they said. Students were typically not permitted to have smartphones before they reached their early 20s. In recent years, those without phones were allowed to browse the internet for just 15 minutes a day and only from designated computers. I think they studied other cults and realized how much the internet was the beginning of the end for them, like Children of God. The school controlled the music they listened to, the movies they watched, and the books they read. They were barred from looking at ordinary media, the movement's name for unapproved news outlets. Military, only Fox News is played on bases usually, and leaders will definitely try to tell you what not to read. I was mocked once for reading fiction. But there's always a general's reading list on the post that you're assigned to, and you're always expected to be reading something from there, even if you are, especially if you're an officer. And their sense of obligation to the movement led many of the performers to tolerate long hours and low pay, they said. That's the constant sacrifice of members. 8 former Shen Yun performers said they were not paid at all, exploitation of labor, in their first year on tour. One former musician said her orchestra manager explained that this was because newer performers had not yet saved enough people. In their second year on tour, students were typically paid a few $100s a month, with the rate increasing over time. A former violinist who asked to be identified only by his last name, Liu, said he came to feel exploited as cheap labor. The amount of money we were making them and also saving them was pretty ludicrous, said Mr. Liu, who moved to Dragon Springs in 2012 at age 12 and left in 2017. At the time, I definitely was very concerned about the fact that we were getting nothing and they were getting lots of money. Shen Yun spends a far smaller share of its revenue on salaries than several other large nonprofit dance and theater companies based in New York, a review of tax filings show. Students often work 6 days a week and were made to feel like they should be grateful for any pay, some of them said. By their early to mid-20s, most of the performers were being paid $12,000 a year or less, they told the Times. After graduating college at Dragon Springs, some of the student performers remained with the group as professionals and earned more. The group also recruited some outside professional musicians for its orchestra. In their statements, the representatives of Shen Yun and Falon Gong said that the accounts of low pay for underage performers were a gross mischaracterization of the group's employment practices. And this is just one of those things that, like, when you have to stand there and say, we don't underpay our employees, like, why do you even have to say that? Shen Yun's Performing Arts is a professional arts company staffed only by professional adults, which is a clear lie since they have so many 12-year-olds. They said, adding that qualified students at Dragon Springs are allowed to tour with the group as part of their studies. Oh, how cute. The program is legal, transparent, and highly sought after opportunity for aspiring artists, they said. The stipend that students receive while on practicum is an industry standard practice. Leaving the fold. A lot of you are going to relate to this part. The tactics used by Shen Yun's leaders often terrified those performers who thought about leaving. They were told that they would go to hell or face stiff financial penalties or be put in physical danger if they lost Mr. Li's spiritual protection. When Daisy Wang, the former dancer, was caught texting with an outsider in 2017 about life off the mountain, Ms. Li interrogated her for hours until Ms. Wang gave up the other person's identity. She quit a few months later, but it took years, she said, for her to get over her fear of going to hell. Because a big thing cults do is tell you that you will die or not succeed without them on the outside. And by the way, U.S. military 100% does this. Nathan Z, the former cellist, announced he was leaving in 2020, and Ms. Li angrily told him he would have to repay 8 years of tuition, an amount that might have exceeded $200,000. It was a threat that 6 other performers said they had also received. The group never followed through, but the episode rattled Mr. Z. He was 22 and had just a few $100,000 in the bank. And by the way, saying that they're going to enforce like non-legal contracts is another thing that cults often do. Chang Chun-ko, another former dancer, feared that she would die in an accident any moment after leaving the Dragon Springs in 2020, convinced she had lost the mystical protection. Mr. Li said to have extended Shen Yun performers assisting him in saving the world. And when Joshua Lin, the violinist, began to have doubts about the movement around 2012, he tried to push them aside. He had lived at Dragon Springs since he was 15 and for years had poured himself into studying Mr. Li's teachings. But by 2017, at age 24, his devotion had fully waned. He watched a YouTube video about cults and was caught sharing it with another musician soon after. I really wish I had worn my shirt that says, "If it quacks like a cult," today. He was expelled mid-tour. On the plane home to Australia, he thought all of the friends he had grown up with on the mountain and how he might never see them again. And if the cost of leaving an organization is losing all of your friends, leaving is not free. Only later did he come to view his expulsion as a blessing. I have that. He has worked as a swim teacher and co-owned a chain of chicken restaurants, and now he hopes to open an auto repair business. Mr. Lin, 31, says he wonders what he might have done with his life if he had not spent 9 years at Dragon Springs. That's always the thing. Like, I think I would have been a scientist if I had had any sort of STEM education whatsoever. He worries about the students still living on the mountain. It's just not good for people that are coming in, being taken advantage of now, especially the younger ones, Mr. Lin said. It is just going to be an ongoing cycle. And that it is, because they're going to get better and better at hiding their crimes. And another reason for cults to choose to hide in the US is because we have 0 laws about coercive control. So if you're 18 and you look and appear to be in sound mind, the police ain't going to do nothing to help you. And your really only hopes of exposing your cult are, well, getting an article in the New York Times. Anyways, hope this has been interesting and helpful to see. This was my first reading of it, that like every single thing here is textbook cult. Because cults ultimately are always the same. It's always one formula of doing coercive control.